Four grown men surrounded her in the middle of Jackson Square, smirking, silent, certain no one would stop them. But they didn't count on her dog. They didn't count on history. And they sure as hell didn't count on a 68-year-old black woman refusing to back down. What happened next changed the town and exposed a truth no one was ready for. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. It started with a flag. Not the kind that waves proudly from front porches on holidays, but one that had seen smoke blood and years of silence. Faded at the corners, its deep red stripes dulled by time, it was no longer just cloth. It was history. It was pain. And it was hope stitched into every thread by hands that refused to be forgotten. Denise Gardner didn't carry it like a relic. She carried it like a memory she was tired of everyone pretending didn't exist. On most days, it remained carefully folded in a cedar box in her living room, resting between old photographs and the folded uniform of the man she once loved. But today wasn't most days. Today was the 60th anniversary of the Selma March, and Denise had decided against the quiet wishes of a town that had long preferred polite forgetting that the flag would fly again. The sun was dipping behind the cathedral spires of Jackson Square, bathing the plaza in soft gold. But Denise's eyes weren't on the light. They were on the shadow, stretching from the corner of the park, the same shadow that had lingered there every evening for weeks. It belonged to a group of men who weren't kids anymore, but still acted like the world owed them its knees. Bo Callahan stood at the center, leaning against the marble steps like he had carved them himself. Beside him were three others, Rex Landon and Mike, each with the kind of laughter that curdled blood. They didn't speak when Denise walked by, but they didn't need to. Their silence was a language all its own. Denise didn't flinch. She never did. Not when they keyed her car last summer. Not when someone spray-painted "Move" on her fence. And not now. Her steps were measured, deliberate. At her side was Orion, a black Labrador with quiet eyes and the build of a storm. He moved like a soldier because he had been one. Trained as a K9 search and rescue dog, Orion had once found bodies in the wreckage of hurricanes. Now, he watched shadows for signs of hatred. Denise reached the wooden beam, erected by local organizers, a makeshift memorial, already surrounded by candles and hand-drawn signs. She stepped up, pulled the flag from her satchel, and began to tie it to the pole. Her hands didn't tremble, but her heart beat with a warning thud. Behind her, Bo shifted his weight. She didn't turn around. Instead, she whispered under her breath, "Steady now, not to Orion, but to herself." What happened next would stain the soul of the square forever. 2 nights later, she returned, not for a march, not for attention, but simply to take the flag home. The wind had picked up, and she didn't trust the weather to be kind. But the square wasn't empty. It never really was, not in a town like New Orleans. The street performers were gone. The jazz was silent, but the shadows remained, and tonight they moved. At first, she thought the footsteps behind her were just echoes. But then came the scrape of boots. 4 pairs. Too close. Too casual. Like they owned the ground they walked on. Orion stopped walking. His tail stiffened. A low growl began to rise from his chest, guttural primal. Denise didn't have to look. She knew. You forgot something. Beau's voice slithered through the dark like a knife. Thought we'd help you bring it home. She turned slowly, flag still in hand. There they were, 4 men smirking, relaxed circling like coyotes. Beau stepped forward, eyes on the flag like it was a trophy. Funny thing, history, he said, licking the edge of a cigarette paper between his teeth. Some folks just don't know when to let it go. Let what go? Denise's voice was calm, almost amused. Truth memory, or your guilt. That hit something. His eyes narrowed, and his smile slipped. You think waving that old rag makes you special, he snarled. This square ain't yours. Never was. Behind him, Rex spat onto the ground. Landon cracked his knuckles. Mike shifted nervously, but said nothing. Denise stepped back once enough to feel Orion pressed firm against her leg. The growl had deepened, controlled, but ready. Beau's hand twitched toward the flag, and for the briefest moment, Denise saw something else. Not just 4 angry men, but the crowd that once threw bottles at her father during sit-ins. The cop who smiled too wide before swinging his baton. The teacher who accidentally skipped over her name every roll call. It was all here coiled like a snake in the square. She spoke one word, guard. It was not loud. It didn't need to be. Orion launched forward, not wild, not savage, but with the precision of something born to protect. He didn't bite. Not yet. He did what he was trained to do. He pinned. Beau was on the ground before he could blink his wrist, bent backwards, his face inches from the flag he tried to steal. The square went still. The others froze. For a second, no one moved. Then came the siren, distant, but drawing closer. Someone had called. A local vendor, maybe. Or a tourist who'd seen too much. It didn't matter. What mattered was that for the first time in their lives, these men weren't in control. Beau howled as Orion released his grip, backing into position between Denise and the others. She didn't say run, but they did. Every step of their retreat echoed louder than any punch could have. And as the red and blue lights painted the marble steps, Denise turned toward the flag. One edge was torn. The rip hadn't come from time. It had come from hands that didn't know what they were trying to destroy. She picked it up, brushed off the dirt, and turned toward the officers, approaching with caution. Don't worry, she said, folding the flag with quiet care. I'm not the one who needs protecting tonight. And just like that, the square learned her name. The headlines spread faster than Denise had imagined. It wasn't the kind of story that people whispered about in grocery aisles. It was the kind that hit Twitter feeds, made its way into comment sections, and landed squarely in the 10 o'clock news cycle. Elderly woman's dog fends off racist attack in Jackson Square. One headline read as if it had been ripped from a movie script. But Denise knew better. She knew what really happened hadn't begun or ended with one act of violence in the dark. The truth was heavier than that. Colder. 3 nights had passed since that moment in the square. She hadn't slept much. She could still hear Beau's voice in the back of her mind, venom wrapped in confidence. And she could still feel the pull of Orion's leash as he pressed himself between her and the threat, trained and trembling, not with fear, but with control. What haunted her, more than the confrontation, was the silence that followed it. The day after the incident, Denise returned to the square flag folded neatly beneath her arm. Not to prove a point, not to reclaim space, she had already done that. She came back to feel the ground beneath her feet again, to see if anything had truly changed. But Jackson Square wasn't the same. Something in its air had shifted. Where once musicians played and children danced along to brass instruments, there was now a stiffness like the wind itself was holding its breath. A few locals spotted her as she crossed the plaza. A couple of them nodded politely, but the way their eyes slid quickly to the ground afterward told her more than words ever could. Two women who'd once volunteered with her at the museum pulled their strollers closer and turned down a side street. Denise didn't wave. She'd long since stopped expecting people to choose courage when cowardice came easier. Inside her favorite corner cafe, the barista hesitated when taking her order. He glanced at the manager, who gave a tight nod before punching the keys with awkward precision. She got her coffee. She didn't get a smile. When she turned to leave, she noticed a pair of young men near the window staring. One of them whispered something behind a cupped hand, and the other laughed too hard. Back home, Denise placed the flag gently on the coffee table and sat across from it, staring at the ragged tear Beau had made. She could have stitched it, but part of her didn't want to. Maybe it needed to remain broken. Maybe the wound needed to be visible, because wasn't that the truth of it all? This country had spent decades patching over things it didn't want to reckon with. Denise wasn't interested in mending what needed to be faced. Orion rested by the door, his eyes always open, his breathing shallow but steady. He had not barked once since that night, but he had not let her out of his sight either. He watched the windows, followed her from room to room, like a shadow with a purpose. The silence around her grew louder. Her phone barely rang, except for a call from her sister in Chicago who had seen the story online. "Are you all right?" she asked, with a tremble in her voice. "I'm fine," Denise said. "You don't sound fine. No one ever does when they realize the truth doesn't protect you." She didn't mean for the words to sound bitter, but they did. By the end of the week, the mail arrived in clumps. Some of it, supportive cards from strangers, a bouquet from a civil rights organization, a handwritten note from a fifth-grade class in Atlanta thanking her for her bravery. But wedged between them was an unsigned letter, scribbled in messy black ink. "You should have let the dog finish what he started. That would have been justice." Denise folded it slowly, like she was sealing a piece of history she'd long known would resurface. She didn't report it. She'd learned long ago that threats made in shadow rarely drew serious attention until they left scars. What did draw attention, oddly enough, was what she did next. On a quiet Sunday morning, she returned to the square, not to protest, not to preach. She wore a simple navy blue coat and held a small sign, "Still Here." That was all it said. She stood alone for nearly an hour, Orion at her side, while the town moved cautiously around her. No chants, no speeches, just presence. And it was enough to unsettle them. The next day, the sign appeared in graffiti across the back of her garage. Only this time, it read, "Still Stirring Trouble." She didn't paint over it, not yet. Instead, she stood in front of it, hands on her hips, and let herself feel everything she'd been taught to suppress: rage, sadness, betrayal. But what emerged wasn't despair. It was focus. That night, Denise pulled out a notebook she hadn't touched in years. On the first page, she wrote, "They want silence. I will give them a record." She began journaling the details, not just of what had happened, but of what followed. The quiet punishments, the withdrawn invitations, the way the neighborhood seemed to close around her like a shrinking room. She wrote about the way the world reacted to her age, her race, her defiance. And most of all, she wrote about Orion, about how he had sensed what no one else would admit was coming. As she wrote, the cold began to recede, not from the town, but from within her. There was clarity in naming what others pretended didn't exist. She wasn't going to wait for someone else to tell her story. Later that week, Denise walked out to the square again. She didn't carry a sign this time. Instead, she wore her husband's old field jacket and brought a folder of hand-printed flyers. They read, "Walk for Unity this Saturday. All welcome. Silent march. Bring no weapons, only purpose." She placed them around the city one at a time. Some were torn down within hours, but some remained. And the cold, for the first time in days, began to crack. Because sometimes the first sound that breaks a frozen place isn't a shout, it's footsteps. And Denise was walking again. The night of the march arrived without ceremony, without fanfare, just a thick, humid silence that clung to the streets like fog. Denise stood alone near the edge of Jackson Square, dressed in a deep gray raincoat, her hands steady as she unfolded the same flag that had drawn so much hatred. Its tear still showed, but she left it that way on purpose. A scar didn't make a thing broken, it made it honest. Orion stood beside her, as ever quiet and alert eyes scanning the shadows even as the square began to fill with bodies. People arrived slowly, cautiously, as if unsure whether they were joining a protest or standing on the edge of something that might crack wide open. There were no chants, no megaphones, no signs held high. Only faces lit by flickering candlelight and the glow of street lamps. Some brought children. Others brought silence. Denise didn't speak to anyone at first. She just held the flag, her breath slow. And even until a woman, Emily Garrison, the young neighbor who had helped her repaint the vandalized garage, stepped forward and took her place beside her without a word. And then another man joined, and then a couple, and then two students with hoodies pulled low. And in less than 10 minutes, there were more than 50 people standing in the square, all of them silent. The sound of their presence was weightier than any speech. Denise took the first step forward. They followed. The group moved as one their footsteps, a soft rhythm on the old stone streets. They passed the cafe, where Denise had once felt the burn of humiliation in a barista's awkward glance. They passed the art vendors who had pretended not to see her. None of that mattered now. What mattered was the sound of walking a quiet rebellion against forgetting. But not everyone watched in silence. From the second-floor balcony of an old hotel, a voice jeered down, "Go home. No one cares." A bottle crashed to the sidewalk near the group's rear. Denise didn't flinch. Neither did anyone else. Orion let out a low growl, but didn't break stride. They kept walking. It wasn't a protest, not exactly. It was something older, more elemental, like grief made physical. A collective act of remembrance. A testimony written in footsteps. When they returned to the square after nearly an hour, the group stood together in a rough circle. No one spoke. Denise raised the flag high for just a moment before lowering it back down with slow reverence. It wasn't about making a statement. It was about claiming space again, not with volume, but with truth. Later that night, Denise sat alone on her porch. Her legs ached, her back throbbed, but she couldn't stop thinking about the sound of those footsteps, the way they filled the streets without violence, without slogans, just presence. That was what the town didn't understand. Her fight wasn't about confrontation. It was about being seen, about reminding people that her history, this history, had always lived here, even when it was buried under fear and silence. She looked over at Orion, curled near the screen door, one eye still open. He hadn't barked once all night, but he hadn't needed to. His body had been a constant guiding, a presence just as vital as her own. The phone rang, cutting through the night. Denise hesitated before answering. The voice on the other end was one she hadn't expected. "This is Assistant District Attorney Jerome Price," the man said, his tone measured, respectful. "I'd like to talk to you about pressing formal charges." She leaned forward slowly, heart thudding. "We've reviewed the footage from the square," Price continued, "and we've taken statements from several marchers. There's a pattern here, Ms. Gardner, a long one. And I believe you're at the center of something bigger than you even realize." Denise didn't speak for a long moment. She knew what he meant. Not just about the men who had circled her that night, but the system that had always made space for them to do it. The system that had taught them they could. "I'm tired, Mr. Price." She finally said, her voice dry. "I believe you," he replied. "But I also believe you're not done yet." And he was right. She wasn't. Because while the march was over, the silence wasn't. The town was still split. The fear was still thick. And the real confrontation hadn't even begun. After she hung up, Denise walked back inside. She placed the flag gently back into its cedar box. Orion followed, brushing gently against her leg, like a shadow that would never leave. She didn't need to say a word, because some nights silence wasn't a retreat. It was the calm before the fire. The courthouse in New Orleans didn't look like a battleground, but Denise Gardner knew better. Battles weren't always fought with fists or fury. Sometimes they were fought in fluorescent-lit rooms where truth and memory sat side by side, each waiting to be believed. The days leading up to the hearing felt like a slow march through deep water. Her phone rang. More now, reporters, former colleagues, old friends offering polite concern or veiled warnings. But none of it mattered more than the folder Jerome Price placed gently in her hands. He'd come to her house personally. Not with a press team. Not with a crowd. Just him, a folder full of documents, and a voice full of urgency. "This," he said, "is what we're walking into." Inside were affidavits, timelines, police statements, and the grainy but unmistakable stills pulled from a cafe's security footage. There was Bo Callahan, captured mid-lunge. Rex's arms folded, smirking. Landon's face partially turned, but his posture unmistakable, watching, enabling. And Mike off to the side, doing nothing. But doing nothing had never meant innocence. Denise stared at the images without blinking. She didn't need reminders. The scene was etched in her skin. "We'll charge them with attempted intimidation, physical harassment, and property violation," Jerome explained. "But there's more." She looked up. "One of our investigators traced a series of encrypted messages on a local forum," he said. "We believe Bo was organizing more than just one act of aggression. We think this is part of something wider, a network, not just a fluke." It didn't surprise her. She had seen these patterns before. In the 50s, it was handwritten newsletters and smoke-filled back rooms. Now it was private groups online, hidden in plain sight. She nodded. "What do you need from me?" Jerome paused, then said softly, "Testimony. Public. Direct. Not just about what happened that night, but about what's been happening in this town for years." Denise let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in her lungs since childhood. She knew what this would cost. Standing in court telling the truth meant tearing the mask off a town that preferred smiling denial. "They're going to call me angry," she said. "They already are," Jerome replied. "Might as well make it count." The trial opened on a wet Monday morning. Rain painted the courthouse steps like melted glass. Protesters stood on both sides of the building. Some carried signs that read, "Justice for Denise." Others carried slogans that made her stomach twist, "Don't divide us." They're just boys, and one that read simply, "Silence is peace." Inside, the air was stiff with tension. Bo and his crew sat in pressed shirts, faces scrubbed clean of bravado. Their lawyers looked polished and confident, carefully framing them as misguided, not malicious. They were joking, one argued, a misunderstanding between neighbors. But the footage didn't joke, and neither did Denise. When she took the stand, the courtroom seemed to lean forward. She didn't speak with rage or performance. She spoke with precision. She told them about the flag, about the words Bo said, about the way Orion had stiffened just before it all unfolded. She described the coldness in the air, the laughter that didn't come from amusement, but from assurance, the kind of laugh men let out when they believe the world has already sided with them. Then she paused, and she let the silence stretch long enough to make them uncomfortable. "I've lived in this town since I was 21, she said, voice steady. "I know its heartbeat. I know its mask. And I know that what happened to me didn't start that night. It started the first time I was told to tone it down. It started when I was 15 and watched my father get shoved by a cop for standing too tall. What Bo and his friends did wasn't new. It was inherited." There were murmurs. One of the jurors shifted in her seat, crossing her arms. A man in the back row, someone she didn't know, nodded once eyes fixed on her. The defense tried to paint her as theatrical, too eager to make something political out of something personal. But the footage said otherwise. And so did the bruises Bo left when he tried to rip the flag from her hands, the torn fabric, the eyewitness testimony, the letters, the threats, the silence. Jerome Price closed his argument with simple clarity. "This case isn't about noise," he said. "It's about a woman who stood still when she was told to vanish. It's about whether we believe in accountability or just comfort. And it's about whether we still recognize right when it doesn't whisper, but roars." By the time the court adjourned that day, the media outside had doubled. Reporters shouted questions Denise didn't bother answering. She wasn't there for interviews. She was there for reckoning. That evening, she returned home to find another envelope under her door. This one didn't have slurs. It didn't have threats. It was from a young girl named Leah, age 13. It read, "My mom said, what you did made the town look bad. But I think it made it brave. I want to be like you when I'm old." Denise folded the note carefully and placed it beside her flag. Outside, the night deepened. Orion slept by the front door, paws twitching in a dream. And somewhere in the distance, Denise knew the verdict was already stirring, not just from the jury, but from every person watching to see what would come next. The verdict came on a Thursday morning beneath a sky that threatened rain but never quite opened. Denise Gardner sat in the front row of the courthouse, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her breath measured like a prayer in progress. Orion wasn't allowed in the courtroom, but she could feel him anyway, waiting outside, steadfast as ever, like the final word in a sentence only she had dared to write. The jury returned without dramatic flourish. 12 people, each carrying the weight of what they had witnessed over the past week, filed in with eyes unreadable. The room held its breath. Then the forewoman stood paper in hand and began. On all charges guilty. The word echoed more like thunder than judgment. Guilty of attempted harassment, guilty of criminal intimidation, guilty of conspiracy to incite a hate-motivated act. Denise didn't exhale. Not yet. She watched as the names were read one by one. Bo Callahan, Rex Monroe, Landon Price, Mike Ellery, one after the other, all guilty. Bo's jaw tightened, but his face gave nothing away. Denise didn't look at him for long. He wasn't the reason she was here. He had been the match. The fire, though, that had long lived in the silence of places like Jackson Square. Judge Halberd delivered the sentences with a calm that didn't match the storm behind the words. Bo received 9 years without parole. The others 6 and 5, respectively. Not a lifetime, not a final blow, but enough to send a message. Enough to mark the end of a season where men like them believed the town was theirs to rule without question. Afterward, Denise stepped outside to find a small crowd gathered. She hadn't asked for them, but they came. Some clapped softly. Some just watched. A young mother with a toddler on her hip mouthed the words, "Thank you." Nearby, a man in a maintenance uniform removed his cap as she passed. The gestures were quiet, but they filled her with more warmth than any speech ever could. And then there was Orion, waiting at the base of the steps, his body still, but his eyes alive. When she approached, he pressed into her legs, as if to say, "I knew you would finish it." She leaned down and placed a hand on his back, then turned to the crowd, with no need for ceremony. Later that week, Denise was invited to speak at the local community center. The same hall that had once politely declined her requests for space now offered her the floor without condition. She stood beneath a yellow light bulb, surrounded by neighbors, strangers, and those who still weren't quite sure what side they were on. "I didn't go to court for revenge," she said. "I went for truth. And truth is never convenient. It doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it walks quietly. Sometimes it bleeds. But it always matters. People listen not just with their ears, but with something deeper." And for the first time in a long while, Denise felt the shift. Not in everyone, but in enough. Weeks passed. The story faded from headlines, but not from hearts. The flag she had carried was framed and donated to the city museum, displayed alongside a plaque that didn't talk about hate, but about resistance, about presence, about standing in the middle of a storm with nothing but a wounded flag, an old truth, and a dog that refused to let her fall. Denise still walked through Jackson Square most evenings. She no longer needed to scan the shadows. Orion did that for her. But more than that, the shadows themselves had changed. Vendors nodded now. Musicians tipped their hats. And children ran past her without flinching, like the square had become theirs too. On the first Saturday of the new season, she led a second silent walk. This time nearly 100 people showed up. Black, white, young, old. Some carried candles. Some brought nothing but open hearts. And as they moved through the city, their footsteps spoke the words that history had tried to forget. "We're still here. We're not afraid. We walk forward." And somewhere, between the cobblestone echoes and the beating of her heart, Denise Gardner finally let herself believe what she had always hoped was true. Courage wasn't something you were born with. It was something you chose. One step at a time. In the heart of New Orleans, beneath the shade of moss-covered oaks, and the watchful gaze of a city shaped by centuries of resilience, Denise Gardner stood her ground. What began as an ordinary act, raising a torn symbolic flag in Jackson Square, unfolded into a quiet revolution. Hers wasn't a story marked by grand speeches or media spectacles, but one defined by integrity, courage, and the unshakable bond between a woman and her dog. Denise's journey started with memory and conviction. A retired civil rights advocate, she returned to the square, not for fame or protest, but to honor those who came before her. Carrying a historic flag from Selma, a relic of blood and hope, she refused to let time erase the struggle etched into its fibers. But when that silent act of remembrance was met with hostility, when Bo Callahan and his gang tried to intimidate her, to desecrate a history they refused to understand, Denise did not fold. With Orion, her fiercely loyal Labrador, by her side, she held the line not just for herself, but for every voice that had ever been silenced. Their confrontation was not just a single moment of self-defense. It became a mirror held up to the town, reflecting deep, uncomfortable truths that many had chosen to ignore. Denise didn't just survive the attack, she carried it forward, documenting the aftermath, confronting the backlash, and refusing to be boxed into the tired stereotype of angry or troublemaker. Instead, she led with presence, with purpose, with power that came not from retaliation, but from standing tall in the face of injustice. When the legal system finally caught up, it was Denise's calm clarity and unshakable testimony that brought accountability. She didn't scream. She didn't accuse. She told the truth. And in that courtroom, truth was enough. The guilty verdicts handed down were more than sentences. They were acknowledgments that silence no longer shielded hate, that community meant something deeper than comfort for the powerful. But perhaps the most powerful part of Denise's story came after the trial. Rather than retreat into safety, she returned to the streets. She walked. She gathered people. She led silent marches that said more in their footsteps than 1,000 signs ever could. She transformed her personal ordeal into collective healing. The flag, once nearly torn from her hands, now hangs in a museum as a testament not only to the past, but to what one person can still do in the present. So what can we take from Denise Gardner's story? We learn that courage is not loud. Sometimes it looks like a woman standing still when the world tells her to run. It's choosing to act even when you're scared, even when no one else is watching, even when doing the right thing means doing it alone. We learn that history is not a finished chapter. It is a living, breathing presence that must be protected, especially when others try to erase it for comfort. Most of all, we learn that change doesn't always arrive with a riot or a roar. Sometimes it walks quietly through the streets, with a wounded flag, a loyal dog, and a purpose too big to be broken. In your own life, maybe you've been told to sit down. Maybe you've felt invisible. Maybe you've watched people rewrite the truth because it's easier than facing it. Denise's story is your reminder you are never too old, too tired, or too alone to make a stand. Your presence matters. Your voice matters. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is show up again and again until the silence around you is replaced with understanding. If this story moved you, if it stirred something in you that refuses to be silent any longer, then support stories like these by subscribing to our channel. It helps us keep telling the truth, uplifting voices like Denise's, and bringing you content that doesn't just entertain, but inspires. We're just getting started. Subscribe now, and let's walk forward together.